certain OECD countries are becoming vociferous with their discomfort with CBI initiatives. So particularly the Europeans, I believe the Americans don't like it either, but they haven't been too overt with that, but definitely the Europeans have been at the forefront of critiquing them. And they found, obviously there were certain irregularities, but even before the irregularities with Cyprus, they were against it. And now we have legal action against Malta, with Malta is basically the last man standing in Europe. And my thinking is that once they have their house in order, then they will look outwards. And, for example, we saw what happened with Vanuatu, losing access to certain, jurisdictions that they could have entered visa-free. My concern is that perspective would be expanded and they would target CBI programs in general. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that you are correct that at some point they are probably going to target our jurisdictions. I think that unfortunately we're generally painted with the same brush, and I think that they have had issues with Cyprus, like you said, with Vanuatu. But when it comes to the CBI in the Caribbean generally, I think we're very well regulated. I think that, of course, you're not going to quote unquote catch every bad apple, because there's this, there's this train of thought where some countries, they expect you to more or less know someone is a criminal before they're actually a criminal. You're not going to, someone could become a citizen, be a fine person, and then 5 years later perform atrocious deeds, and that's just the reality. All you can do is due diligence today. And I think that the Caribbean region, St. Lucia particularly, Grenada as well, I think they've done a really good job because we want good citizens. If you don't have good citizens and you let in persons which are on Interpol wanted list, who are sanctioned, for example, you really just have, a house of cards which will fall. So maybe today you're going to make some money by getting extra persons in quicker, but in the long term, that's not sustainable. I think the issue with the OECD is they look at things very much from a tax perspective. So for them, the more persons who get citizenship and who have options, that's tax revenue away from them, which I think is very unfortunate, because the CBI, particularly in some of the even smaller islands like St. Kitts and Dominica, the CBI has done so much for the economy and in some ways has been very transformational, But I think that the next year or two is going to be extremely important for our industry. I think that right now there's a lot of lobbying taking place, particularly in Brussels. I think that with what happened in Vanuatu and particularly what's happening in Ukraine, that's surprisingly enough brought an additional spotlight on CBI, since whether or not you should accept Russian citizens and persons from Belarus, that's become a bit of an issue. And also de-risking, what do banks think of CBI? That's also become a whole other issue in itself. So I think the next 2 years are going to be particularly important. But I think the Caribbean region, what we're doing generally is very much fit for purpose. I think our programs are robust. I think that all the jurisdictions, they want good persons as citizens, and that they do enough due diligence, definitely. And that we do this every day. I can tell you the number of documents, how rigorous it is, the sort of questions we get back from the unit for our applicants, and the level of details they go into. I think the programs are fit for purpose, but as I think we saw with our offshore sector and other industries like agriculture and World Trade Organization, it's very difficult, unfortunately, sometimes to please these superpowers. And in many ways, we're just a dot of very little influence. But I think the next 2 years also will be very influential and important for the industry.
Yeah, Darren, we could have a whole series on that topic. I personally have a difficulty with it. I understand and I appreciate and I respect the concerns. I have no personal difficulty with that. What I do have is a difficulty with how the policy is being framed, without any parameters set. I mean, most of these, going beyond the EU, look at the US, they all have some sort of investment program that brings you to ultimately getting citizenship. That is the truth and the reality. I think so. At the core, what it should be a minimum standard on due diligence. For example, there must be some policy that is rolled out on a very high level. That must be some subscription. It could form the framework of some international treaty or some agreement where there is some high level regulation. But I think to just, without more, just, if you like, apply the big stick simply for the reason that you have our CBI program is not good enough. And I think that, taking that stance is unfair and unjust, inequitable, without delving into the mechanics of each and taking each case on its own facts and on its own merits. You cannot compare one jurisdiction to the other because of the policy. You cannot compare one jurisdiction to the other because of, the level of due diligence that it might apply. But you're wanting to apply a broad brush across every program simply on the basis that you have an RCBI program and nothing more. There's no merit in investigating each one. So as I said, we could go on ad infinitum on this one, but I do find at its core, without more, it's unjust and unfair, quite honestly.
Absolutely. And in the case of Malta, which of course is facing legal action from Brussels, they not just have one service provider providing due diligence, they actually require two. So, it's like double, yet still the sentiment is what it is. And then recently we've had one of the government ministers in Portugal who has hinted that the golden visa may be reviewed and come to an end. Regardless of how much billions of euros it's contributed to Portugal. So it's crystal clear that the powers that be have a perspective, and it is what it is. And it's interesting that you drew that historical perspective, because yes, there was agriculture, there was the Lomé Convention, and the bananas had preferential access. Then there was the offshore sector, and that went its own way. And now we have CBI, and maybe not. And I guess the question perhaps for another time would be, what's next for Solution, the other four?
So if you're a 6, 7, or 8-figure investor, entrepreneur, or business owner who needs a tailor-made solution from a qualified team of professionals, we can help you achieve the international lifestyle, the freedom, and even the tax savings you're looking for. Visit us at htj.tax and live that international life.